Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned. Today we're missing Julia, who is away in Malaysia, but Heather and I are going to be taking you through our favourite stories of the week. And when I say favourite, just ones that we find interesting and think tell us something about the way the world is changing. I'm going to kick off with a story about Nestle. Now, I'm sure we've all been reading about how Easter eggs this year are going to be more expensive, or have been more expensive, actually. And the reason for that is climate change, the impact that's being made on the growth of cocoa. Now, what Nestle has done is launch a couple of new projects, which is actually intended to remove carbon emissions from the supply chain. What's really interesting to me about this is we talk a lot about scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3, so supply chain emissions. But Nestle has actually done a net zero roadmap which says that sourcing of ingredients accounts for more than 70% of Nestle's greenhouse gas emissions. And one part of that, because again, we talk about nature a lot, about 25 to 35% of their total ingredient emissions is actually caused by the conversion of natural landscapes. That's a really, really, really scary thing. The company is actually planning on addressing these agricultural emissions by avoiding and eliminating deforestation, so the conversion of natural landscapes, the conservation of natural habitat, and of course the planting of hundreds of millions of trees. So what the projects are planning on doing is promoting agroforestry. So the idea is to accelerate the transition to regenerative agriculture and, most importantly, support the reforestation of degraded lands around cocoa farming communities. So where they're working is in Ghana and the Ivory Coast. So what they've got is 2 5-year projects which are part of its so-called time-bound plan to reach its climate goals. That's meant to be a 20% emissions reduction by 2025, that's next year, and 50% by 2030. So the idea is they're intending to plant over 2 million shade trees on land that's managed by, I think it's around 20,000 farmers in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. And that should actually result in 500,000 metric tons of carbon removal and reduction over 20 years. What's really exciting to me about this is there's often talk of tree planting as a means of taking action on carbon emissions. You know, we've all seen those adverts, buy your plane ticket for here and we'll plant some trees for you. But this is a really integrated approach where they're actually working really closely with local communities. And the bit that's exciting to me, because as you know, I'm obsessed by soil, is it's about restoring the health of land around these commercial areas, using fallow land for reforestation, starting tree nurseries, really starting to change the way in which Nestle's looking at its supply chain. And again, you know me, I always have multiple reasons why I get excited about a certain story. And one of the reasons I got excited about this one is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which last month launched its guidance on beyond value chain management. So that's actually about how it can use interventions across the supply chain to accelerate the world's net zero targets. So it's going beyond what they call their own science-based targets. What this is about is mitigating future risks and building long-term value in land, in communities. And obviously it's completely dependent on, where a company operates, what's the region, the market, what are they trying to source. But it's really genuinely taking a look at the wider impact of the way in which you do business and understanding how that wider impact is going to impact on how you're able to do business, on what operational choices you're able to make, where you're able to source what's going on. I think the idea is under the SBTi, because we all know, 5 to 10% was the SBTi limit of carbon emissions that you can use to meet your net zero targets. But what the SBTi is saying is you do have to keep cutting your own emissions, your internal emissions. That's got to be a priority. But that if you do beyond value chain management, you can take responsibility for emissions beyond the value chain And you can actually set a fee and use that fee to fund these actions up to a proportion of 50% of value chain emissions. Now, you still have to progress your value chain targets. You still have to do your internal emissions. You can't use carbon credits for that. But it's a way of taking responsibility and moving beyond the limitations of, saying, well, we can only use 5 to 10% here, but we need to take action now as well, because it can take a few years to actually transform those internal operations. And what it's saying is, if you're serious, yes, you're going to act on cutting your own emissions, but you're actually going to contribute to how we change things in the wider world. And that to me is potentially incredibly powerful, and also potentially a real driver for action in the carbon markets. At the moment, I think it's only 2 billion a year is the value of the carbon markets. And we've got trillions and trillions in missing finance to change the way in which we make the world work.
So I think what I find quite interesting about this, and I'm going to try and tread quite carefully here, but so beyond value chain, it's really about, going above and beyond. It's sort of going beyond the bare minimum. And this is where it comes to my treading carefully. But Nestle has a bit of a history, a bit of notoriety surrounding it, you could say. And that's both in terms of environmental impact and then also a lot of social and economic issues as well that it has been tied to. And this is something that I've mentioned this before with regards to, say, the fashion industry or something, but I do sometimes wonder if the big behemoths that 5-10 years ago were held up as the pinnacle of all evil have almost sort of overtaken their peers. And yes, in some ways it's maybe just kind of making up for things gone wrong, but if that's what it takes to propel you forward, then it is a good thing. And because this does tend to be the much larger companies, Nestle has the resources to invest in massive programs like this, where perhaps some of the newer startups and just smaller brands that have sort of built themselves around being the ethical ones, that have built themselves up as a favorite from the start, they don't have the same resources as someone like Nestle does. And I think that almost adds to the responsibility of the bigger companies.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point, because we talk about transparency a lot. We talk about disclosure, but in the end, transparency alone doesn't do anything. It tells us what's going on. What transparency does do is provide information about, potential impacts, potential problems, potential opportunities. But for those companies that perhaps do have a slightly more complex history and reputation, there is an opportunity to actively do good, and it shows a way of doing it, which, it's interesting to me that the Nestle deal is actually been done in partnership with Cargill and ETG Beyond Beans. But, Cargill doesn't have the world's best reputation when it comes to deforestation. As you say, it's very difficult when talking about reputations, because obviously, a lot of this is built on what we read, what we hear, the expectation and knowledge that a lot of companies, in the kindest possible way, it may not be a deliberate choice, but if they don't have insight into what's going on in their supply chain, then negative things can happen. And transparency is something that can actually drive these companies to do something different. What I'm hoping is we'll see that on a wider basis, and that, as you say, those companies with large balance sheets and huge amounts of money can actually funnel that money to the place where they can do most good.
I think it also makes a very good point just to say that companies are not static. They are not a single entity with intention and an agenda. They have that built up through their employees, their history, their culture. There are so many things that go into a company's strategic direction. And I do think, I've been guilty of this myself, to sort of look at a big bad company and their reputation and just say, right, okay, I cast them to one side, which is important. Consumer pressure is often a reason that things get done. But I do think we also need to sort of exercise that flexibility to say, okay, maybe this is what you did 5 years ago, but can I revisit this? Is there some way I can support now? And speaking of the resources that private companies are throwing around, brings us quite nicely into my story. And I'm going to go with that as a segue. So what I wanted to chat about today was just that the British Standards Institute has released the first version of its nature investment standards. So those are open for consultation just now. And so these standards, they've been developed with funding from DEFRA. I actually wrote about this partnership around this time last year when it began, and at that point they described it as a 3-year project, but I think the plan generally is to have it, an iterative ongoing development. But essentially what they've developed is part of the UK's green finance strategy and its nature markets framework, and it's really setting standard principles and definitions for investing in nature. So that includes sort of the requirements for the design and operation of nature projects that meet desired integrity threshold, as well as processes for generating, trading, and managing units of nature. And I think this is a really important thing to talk about because the research on the nature markets has told us that they're already worth around 10 trillion a year. Just to be clear, this is markets that trade in something to do with nature, basically. It's quite a broad umbrella, undefined term. But apparently we've been told that they're currently worth more than $10 trillion per year. And there's 20 odd million job opportunities stored within that. But the United Nations Environment Programme has warned that investment in nature, and this is nature that can deliver the carbon removal and the ecosystem services that we need to tackle climate change and sort of continue living on this planet. By 2030, we're going to be needing to invest at least $484 billion a year for the protection and restoration of nature. And in 2022, I think we managed about 154 billion. So we've got a massive, massive shortfall, and that shortfall does carry through in the UK. The Green Finance Institute has estimated that until 2032, there's going to be about a £97 billion shortfall in nature investment just within the UK.
Is that every year?
Yes, every year, sorry.
Wow.
So pretty substantial. So all of these numbers, basically what I'm saying is that we are in desperate need of nature investment, but it does have to be investments in high quality, trustworthy, transparent projects. And at the moment, I think this is globally, of the money that is being spent on nature, only 17% of it is coming from the private sector. The rest is largely from governments and non-profits and whatnot. So there's a massive opportunity to stimulate private investment into nature. But at the moment, there's no real guidance of what count as a good project. So investors are sort of left guessing, really. And the reason that these standards are going to be so important is that they can be a checkbox, a quality framework, just to say, like, yes, this is a good investment. This is worth spending your money on. It's trustworthy. Go for it. And hopefully that'll really open up this market and spur things on.
Well, I think that's a really exciting opportunity because if you think about the carbon markets, all the scandals last year about, projects that weren't providing the emissions that were expected or that were based on counterfactuals that were basically made up by the project developers, it made a lot of investors very nervous. There were a lot of people talking about pulling away from the carbon markets. And if you've got a nature-based market, part of that is going to be carbon, part of it is going to be ecosystem services. Private investors aren't going to get involved if they think they might have to walk away from the investment, that if it hasn't got that integrity. Because you mentioned that a very small percentage of the money's coming from the private sector. And to a huge extent, it makes sense that the public sector would invest in nature because it's hard to quantify the return and the benefits and what investors can get out of it. I'm sorry to say it so crudely, but what investors get out of it is actually that's why investors invest. There's a reality about why money gets put in one place rather than another. And without a kind of solid framework that an investor can look to and say, okay, I know as long as I do it this way and in these projects, then my investment is safe. I can work out what the return is. Because I remember that there was a trend in Nature investment report last year, which actually said that about 2/3 of investors were planning on increasing their investments in nature-related ventures. But actually, a lot of them were looking at return, like financial return, not just improved nature outcomes. They're genuinely interested in how they can make money out of this. And while part of me would like to say nature is a public good, nature is something we all require, we should be protecting it and looking after it, we need to find ways to leverage the tools that we've got. And in the current way we look at the way the market works, companies are rewarded for return on investment, financial investment. So you've got to find a way of doing it.
Well, that's the thing. When we're talking about investing in nature, it's an absolute necessity, but it is also a massive opportunity. And I'm going to sort of half-heartedly tie this back around to what we were discussing about Nestle, but the returns are a big part of it, but also investors, whether they be companies or individuals, are also, if they don't know that a project is trustworthy and good quality, that can come to bite them in many ways. It can end up sort of eating into their own reputation. If I've invested in something that I thought was doing the world of good, no one's going to forgive me if it turns out I've actually invested in burning down the Amazon or something.
Yeah, no, I mean, none of us really particularly want to be investing in burning down the Amazon. That's negative in lots of different ways.
Well, exactly. So I would argue that is why we need standards. That being said, I think these things are always going to be criticised, and I think they always should. In fact, I would say they should always be critiqued.
Yeah, that nuance. It's the nuance in how we address things that's so important. Because we talk about this. Do you remember we were having this argument before about green hushing, and that actually companies are nervous about saying what they're doing in case they get into trouble. It's only when we start to bring nuance into the conversation and use critique rather than criticism that we actually get to support positive actions and build things in the right way.
Absolutely. Because, I mean, the closest thing that we have to compare this to would be the carbon markets, which, yes, critique has taken us from standards that didn't account for everything. They didn't account for additionality. They didn't account for social impact. And without critique, we would have said, okay, these are our standards. That's a good project. That's a bad one. But by allowing these things to be developed over time, we've allowed them to get better and better and stronger and stronger. And I think that is a great thing. I think the difference between that and criticism is when we're just discounting something altogether, then nothing's ever going to get done.
Yeah. Exactly. We need to build on them. And one of the things we do need, because it's a consultation, they're asking for input. They're asking for people involved and affected to say, does this make sense? How do we make it better? And I think it's the how do we make it better that really matters.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I decided to pick a story on Julia's behalf because she's not here. And because last week we had World Water Day, I thought it was worth bringing up a story about water, because, again, we're recognising that companies are addressing or beginning to address their carbon emissions. And we know companies are trying to deal with their carbon footprint and obviously their water footprint. But actually, I think a lot of companies don't really yet engage with the management of risk for water. And CDP brought out a report last week which said that 77 billion is under threat due to water risk in supply chains.
Is that dollars, I'm assuming?
Oh, it is. What did I say?
You didn't. I was just checking
I'm
the
terrible
currency.
at that. Yes, the currency, you're quite right. The currency is dollars. But actually, 50% of, the world's largest corporate buyers are starting to engage with suppliers on water issues, but only 14% are actually connecting that engagement with the financial compensation for senior leaders. So what we've got is this issue where we know water's a problem. Water security is recognised as one of the key challenges for a lot of businesses, but especially food and beverage. If they're engaging their supply chain on water security and it's a material issue to their business, why is that not linked to compensation and performance? Because, senior leaders get recompensed based on how well the company's doing, how much money it's making. If it's that critical to the business, then surely there should be some kind of link in some way. And I think it's difficult because there's a lot of monitoring and verification, and it's expensive, and you need to understand where the risks are. But it's fundamentally part of the supply chain issue. And over again, I'm coming across research and announcements and statements and concerns from companies. The supply chain is what literally keeps the whole global economy together. If it starts to fall apart, we've got a huge problem. Water supplies are getting fragile. I was talking about this actually with Dax Lovegrove about how the wine industry is changing. Big droughts in California, and yet we've got wine growing in England. Your supply chain might mean you might have to change where you find your materials, your goods, your services. And I think it's really important you actually link that kind of important impact to what companies are doing and how, I can't think of a better phrase than senior leaders, but certainly it should be, I would think, at the board level. You connect it. Global water demand is expected to go up by 30%. And we've already got real issues in lots of parts of the world on how water impacts operations, on how it impacts livelihoods. I think it's 1 in 5 companies actually report supply chain water risk. And obviously that's fashion and agriculture and food and drinks. And these are not the long-term risks we're talking about climate change, although when I say long-term, I don't know why, given that last year was the hottest year reported. And supply chain issues are planning into the future, and climate change impacts seem to be happening today. But it just means it's a really important thing that we actually have to address. We need to think about how we integrate these risks into how companies operate. Because if you think about the fact that we've got this high percentage of companies that are engaging with their supply chain, what about the ones that aren't and don't have any plan to in the next couple of years? I think 1/5 of these companies said they didn't think the issue was important. And that's manufacturing and agriculture and transport. I don't understand how you cannot recognise that water matters.
I think the real problem here is silos between departments, isn't it? It's not, maybe I'm being naive, but I genuinely think that it's just a case of oversight or just lack of communication between different departments, because you're saying, this percentage of companies is engaging with their suppliers, and somehow only this percentage of companies is integrating water into their corporate bonuses and everything. But we need to think about who in these companies is doing what, because their sustainability department will be working with the suppliers. Meanwhile, their board and other C-suite executives will be deciding on what gets rewarded. So it's just a disconnect. It's not necessarily a contradiction. It's more a lack of flow between different departments, a lack of just talking to one another and understanding why different people in a company are working on different things. Understanding what's happening is very different from replying to a survey saying, oh yes, we've got someone working on that. How would you know if it was important? We can't expect every single person within a company to be entirely knowledgeable about why this is so important. That's why companies have sustainability departments and similarly named departments, is to work on these issues. But we need to get past this just, okay, well, I've hired a team of people to do that. It's taken care of.
Yeah. I love the way you've put that, because actually it's almost replicating that wider recognition we're having about the world as a whole. You're talking about the disconnect between these different groups and these different silos. And actually, a huge part of what's been happening in the policy world in the last couple of years is this recognition of interdependencies in the world. So that nature's dependent on, the economy is dependent on nature because we exist within nature. That 55% of the world's GDP is more than dependent on nature. It's highly dependent. That's like half the global economy. And We as the world have got to start recognising that. Industries have got to start recognising that. But your point that companies have got to recognise those interdependencies between their different departments. It's just like, that's a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because that disconnect is actually where so many of these problems arise.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the statistics you gave there, they're from different studies and surveys, I imagine.
Yes.
And how often is it the same person? I'm sure if you asked someone who works in their company's sustainability department, say the chief sustainability officer, if you ask them, is water important? They will say, yes, it is. But if you go next door and ask their chief technology officer, they will probably say no because someone else is working on it in the other room. It's just like...
Well, I would hope they would know, but I know what you mean.
I'm trying to think of another good example. Like, say two people lived on different sides of the house. You could say to one of them, oh, do you get enough natural light in the morning? And they might say, one will say yes and one will say no. So does the building get enough light?
So no, I love this, because what we're basically saying, we have decided that one of the big challenges to effectively addressing sustainability is that you've got to break down the silos. You can't just have people responsible for reporting and that's not integrated across the whole business. And I know some businesses do recognise this, but I've never come across a business, I don't think, where every single person involved understands why this matters and understands why what they do has a direct impact on the business as a whole.
I mean, it is difficult. It's not as easy as saying, okay, let's all just sit in a circle once a week and explain everything we've done for the past week, because
yeah, it's hard.
Otherwise we get to the stage where every single person is expected to do, or at least to know about, every single job. And, who's got the time and money for that? You can't be up to speed on everything, but it's about communication and how we balance that.
I think you're right. It's about communication, but it's also about materiality. It's actually recognising what are the things that are material to your business and actually having a sensible conversation about it, because I think there are very few companies, say in the fashion industry, given how much water gets used, that you could reasonably say that water is not a material issue for the business as a whole. So I think, there are processes by which we can get better at understanding which bits everybody needs to know and which bits everybody doesn't. But I do think we need to do better at it.
Absolutely, I agree. So basically what I'm saying is it's complicated and I don't have every answer, but I'm going to say my piece anyway.
And I love that. That's what we're here for. Excellent. Thank you so much, Heather. I think it's a good time for us to draw our conversation to a close, and we'll be back. Hello and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned. Today we're lucky enough to be joined by Dax Lovegrove at Salterbaxter. Welcome, Dax. Thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about Salterbaxter and how you got there? Because we met quite some time ago when you actually were running a workshop for the WWF and I was trying to learn all about sustainability. So I'd love to know how you got from there to here.
Thank you, Felicia. Thank you for having me. Yes, I was at WWF for 10 years, as you know, and we met then when I was sort of working with WWF on how it was engaging with business in the most constructive ways. And then I've returned to the private sector and I've been back in the private sector for another 10 years. And I'm with the sustainability consultancy Salterbaxter. Salterbaxter has a very expert specialist team on reporting and CSRD and all those sorts of things. And I don't claim to be an expert in that area, but we have a very good team on that. And Salterbaxter, we also help clients evolve their ESG strategy. We help them implement it by sort of mobilizing staff from within organizations. We help companies communicate and report on ESG.
So basically what you're helping them to do is navigate all of these different frameworks and requirements and disclosure issues. And what is it? What are businesses facing that they need to sort of change the way in which they approach things?
Well, there are these new reporting regulations, including the CSRD coming into force, isn't there? Which means companies have to be much better at collecting information and data. In that they will need to provide more detail for how they identify and manage ESG risks. That's very much part of the CSRD, isn't it? They also need to put a greater financial emphasis on that risk management. So how do they rate all these kinds of ESG risks in terms of financial importance? I think the other healthy aspect of the CSRD is that it takes a more outward-in looking thing, doesn't it? I mean, we've all been talking about impacts and dependencies for many years, but this puts dependencies much more into the spotlight. So you do have to identify and understand and manage the risks of how the changing world impacts you as a business. And so I think the healthy benefit is that it will make companies more outward looking and more forward looking, and ESG will continue to be much more of a value creator. It seems like this whole reporting thing is a burden, but it will help companies identify risks in better ways, in more detail, and understand the world and how it's changing.
And so when you talk about companies having to look at disclosure in terms of impact and sort of outward looking, really you're talking about the impact that the business has on the world around it, both environmentally and socially, as well as the effect on business operations.
Exactly. So impact-wise, you continue to look at how you manage your carbon footprint, your water footprint, how you use energy, how you're using chemicals, how you're managing waste and designing out waste, and all the usual things we all think about, as well as the social impacts and how you treat workers in the supply chain, but also how all those things impact you. And so I suppose we need to continue to better understand that the usual threats we think about, climate change, water issues, landfill costs, those sorts of things, how those impact the business, but also there are newer threats to start to better understand as well. So, I'm sure we'll talk about it, Felicia, but if you rely on the agricultural as part of your supply chain, we see the huge farmer protests in Europe, don't we? And the farmers are under huge financial pressures. But even just the demographics of farmers, young and old farmers think very differently to each other. So how do you contend with that? How do you manage that? And how do you get into the mindset of young and old farmers? And how do you support them going forward with the multiple threats that we all think about in terms of soils and water quality and biodiversity and farming with nature and regenerative farming, and so there are your sort of usual threats we all think about. There are newer threats, just for example, like the demographics of farmers, and if farmers are retiring, what does that mean for the way their land will be used in future? That is not thought about very often.
That's a fascinating thought, and one I genuinely actually hadn't considered, because I do think about agriculture quite a lot just because it's so much part of the nature issue. And I think there's research that shows that over 55% of global GDP is highly dependent on nature. And that's obviously a lot of food and drink and materials-based businesses. But it's also this thing of looking at the impact of different regulations in different places, because you mentioned the French agricultural, I won't call them riots, protests. And obviously the CSRD is demanding more action from companies, but we've got our own rules in the UK, and we've had demonstrations by agricultural workers recently in London. So how does it all connect, the fact that we've got these different regulations in different jurisdictions? Because I suppose my question is, what does this mean in the bigger picture?
Yeah, I mean, there are regional regulations to contend with. However, I think the principles and the challenges are reasonably similar across the regions. I mean, I think farmers, especially in France and also the UK, they're not necessarily against green regulations and constraints. They are more against an unlevel playing field. They don't want to compete with cheap imports that are not having to adhere to the same kinds of environmental standards that they do. And that's what they're against. And also they're under huge financial pressure. So in which case, I mean, in France, we've seen green groups collaborate with the farmers to push on the same front, to say, look, actually, we want to farm with nature. We understand we have to, because nature supports farming and food production and the production of other natural materials. But we need to do it in a fair way. We need a just transition. So I think the principles are the same. If companies start supporting farmers in reasonable ways and going beyond a procurement relationship and into a sort of collaborative partnership, and support farmers with a just transition to green agriculture and regenerative agriculture, I think then you get a more resilient, secure supply chain.
This, again, is an area that fascinates me, because even 3-year-olds are kind of obsessed by fairness and how, and they're taught to share, and that, you shouldn't just hold things back. It seems almost strange that we have a society where one group is expected to bear the brunt of the impacts of the need to change what we do. I mean, I think what interests me here, and I love this idea of green groups collaborating with agricultural workers, is how we go about making that transition juster and fairer. And I think it's, there's a lot going on this year in terms of elections and who's going to get in and who's not. We won't go down that route because I think it's unfair. But I'm really interested in what you see as the opportunity around all of these challenges, because businesses are going to have to spend money to report and to get hold of data and disclose. What's the positive side of this?
Well, the positive side is at the moment it would seem that these new reporting requirements are a huge burden on companies who already have limited resources, limited teams. But if they use the next couple of years to really start to prepare for this, because the CSRD comes into force 2026.
So just next year?
Well, exactly. It's not far away at all. You're reporting on 2025 data in January 2026. So we haven't got long, but you can at least get make a start and start to prepare right now. And then the opportunity is when you start getting into this work, you do start to understand the threats in a more comprehensive way and in more detail, and you start to identify financial implications of these risks. So I think actually there is an opportunity here. So, you're understanding, how do I better support the workforce so that they're less likely to go on strike, so that I less likely have disruptions in my supply chain, when I know the cost of living crisis is putting a real burden on these people. So I need to, as a business, understand what is the risks, which regions should I focus on, how do I support workers in the supply chain in a better way. And you do see companies now who are trying to get above the legal minimum wage, and they are starting slowly but surely to say, I know it's a difficult time, a difficult trading environment, but I still understand I need to look at living wages. And you might do this in a step-by-step sort of phased approach. How do I look at a sample of some of my top suppliers in certain regions? How do I see what they're being paid right now? What's the data on their current levels of pay? What are the local living wage calculations? Is there a gap? How do I address that? And companies are starting to look at that, because that is one area in which companies can better support workers in the supply chain, so that brings more security, so that brings better risk management. I mean, there's other kinds of risks as well. If you look at fashion right now, there's this sort of real interesting move in parts of the fashion sector to look at less seasonal fashion and more adaptable clothing. Because climate change is hitting us. You can't just keep selling warm clothing. From one day you need something that keeps you warm, but you also need, in the same day, the temperature may change, and I need more breathable wear. So some companies are looking at adaptable clothing, from sudden hot temperatures to cooler temperatures to more warmer weather. And so that's fascinating. How do I, and companies, it's a real big sort of threat right now. How do I adapt, provide more adaptable clothing? How do I adapt to climate change? And otherwise I'm just not going to be able to sell the things I usually sell in the usual seasons. Things are changing.
So actually thinking about all of this and starting to measure and understand what you're doing means you can help identify potential new markets.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. If you're moving from just selling warm clothing to adaptable clothes that can protect you in the outdoors, because climate change does bring sort of new kinds of weather events, then that is an opportunity. You might move into an adjacent sector and an adjacent market. So you're absolutely right. The automotive sector is changing as well. I mean, we've seen this huge shift into electric vehicles. Some automotive companies are even moving into energy management and energy trading. That's very interesting. Also micromobility. If you can put your electric scooter in the boot of your electric car, that helps companies, helps the customer travel in new and different ways. That opens new markets, to your point, and opens new business opportunities. So when you buy an electric car and you think about electric scooters, your behaviours are changing. So how does an automotive company adapt to that and create an opportunity out of that, as well as just responding to the risks of having to have less polluting vehicles?
Yeah, because when we talk about risk and opportunity, part of me always goes back to this idea of trade-offs. And one of the things I think about a lot, because I really like drinking wine, is what's happening in the California markets with the droughts and the impact it's having on the wine industry in California. And yet England is starting to develop some really nice wine. And I did have some English wine a couple of decades ago. Can't say it was the best experience of my life, but I had some recently. It's utterly delicious. So I suppose there's trade-offs between different places you'll be able to get things in your supply chain.
There is. I mean, the climate is changing across regions. It means we can grow new things, different things right now. We need to think about moving off things. I mean, the huge sort of ongoing debate is meat and dairy and livestock farming. And, we need to support farmers to produce meat and dairy in better ways. But, there is also a demand for plant-based diets as well. And sometimes plant-based foods can release up land. It takes less land. So that, again, creates opportunities as well. So you're right. Climate is changing in different regions, meaning we can grow different things and provide different things into local markets. We also need to think about high-impact foods and how we produce those things better. And we need to think about sustainable diets, because that's another thing that companies will want to get a handle on. How do you think about the increasing demand for plant-based foods in the future? Personalized nutrition. There's a huge demand now for healthier foods for your own personal needs and what your personal constitution is. So again, that's a whole different ballgame to understand and navigate through. And again, these kinds of reporting requirements help you along to understand the challenges and the opportunities.
And that, I suppose, brings us to the whole question of customers and demand and what people want, and the idea that transparency is going to put some companies in the crosshairs.
Yes. I mean, transparency is something that will have to happen more and more. So people, the conscious customer is on the rise. They do want to understand how their products and services are being made responsibly and provided responsibly. How are people being treated in the supply chain that are producing these things? And demand is changing as well, from products. And if you think about the energy sector, new technologies are coming out. If it's electric boilers or heat pumps, and we all see the news, these are, in the first couple of years, quite clunky technologies, quite expensive. But that very soon changes. And heat pumps, electric boilers the technologies are improving, the costs are coming down. Some energy companies are now getting into energy services to provide those kinds of new technologies while taking the upfront costs out of the picture for customers. So there's a longer term sort of energy service relationship. So, again, that's another area where things are changing and actually people are wanting more solar on the roofs or technologies to help them conserve energy within the homes. And again, that's always been a challenge, but the technologies are coming.
Yeah, I did actually. I got an email this morning offering me a solar subscription, because even though, and I remember when solar power fell, I think the price fell 90% in a decade, but it was still quite expensive to put on. And now you're being offered a subscription service where you're paying £60 a month. And it's so different than it was. And I think, you can see that with lots of different technologies. So that is very exciting. I suppose one thing that comes to mind is this question of whether transparency itself leads to change. So I know that within Europe, the Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive, which is incredibly hard to say, has just got part way through. I think it's been approved by the Parliament. And that's going to demand not just disclosure, but a plan of action. What do you really think is the direction of travel for what companies are going to need to do, and what perhaps regulation might evolve into?
Well, regulations is putting more pressure on companies to be far more transparent. So how are they treating the workforce in the supply chain? How are they sourcing responsibly? How are they working with farmers to look at more regenerative sources? And that is going to be a picture that will be less and less opaque, so which is great for investors because they can now value more clearly how a company is performing in a financial way, but also in what's the ESG performance as well. So, and I think your point is for the customer, just transparency alone doesn't necessarily change behaviors or change demands, but it does at least provide a fuller picture to the customer, so they can also judge brands and switch if they want. But with that needs to come an ease and a convenience. And I think, you just talked about new things in the energy sector. There is this sort of shift from products to services. We see it in energy, as we've just talked about. We see it partly in the fashion industry as well. There's more circular business models, resale, repair, rental, those sorts of things. And some companies are moving further ahead to say, look, actually, we see the future. It's not just about shifting products off shelves. It's about providing alongside that services for repair and other things. And that's across not just fashion, but other sectors as well. So I think it's a better transparency, a fuller picture for customers and investors, but also with that coming a more easy provision of services where you have a more dematerialized way of doing business, a more dematerialized economy, that we're not just relying on materials and resources and products and so on. So that will be part of the shift as well.
I can't tell you how much I love the idea of the dematerialized economy. What's fascinating here is that what's really happening is the industrial world is evolving as it has in the past. You could call it a revolution. Let's call it an evolution for the moment. What should companies be doing to get ready for this? Because I think there are a lot of companies who might think, well, it doesn't apply to me. It's not the right size. It's not me yet. But I mean, from what I understand, the CSRD is going to affect over 75% of companies in the European Economic Area and any non-EU organisation above a certain size that's trading in the EU. That's a lot of companies. What should we do?
Well, spend the next year getting ready. If you're preparing for a double materiality assessment, there are various steps in that process, aren't there? First of all, you build on the materiality assessments you've already done. So you build a list of ESG issues that you have been working on. You then start to identify again your internal stakeholders, who are the key players in your organisation that really has to get a grip with this sort of new requirement, as well as a list of external stakeholders, including part of your customer base. Then you start to design your consultation process, whether that's simple surveys for customers or more complex interviews with technical stakeholders. You're bringing that ESG issues list to the consultation through your various stakeholders. And then you're carrying out your consultations. You're then going through the findings. You're sense checking those findings against desk research about, what's the sort of financial modelling out there? How's the marketplace changing? What are the industry trends you're facing? So you're sense checking your findings of your consultations against that kind of desk research of forward-looking sort of things. And then you're preparing to report. And you need to do that, obviously, in a compliant way. So those are the kinds of steps you're going through. And the signals are very, very clear. Reporting will increase. It will be sort of difficult in the first place, but if you use the next year to prepare, you'll get on top of it. And actually, this will turn into an opportunity. You will be a stronger, outward-looking, forward-looking business that is much more ready for all the different challenges we all face.
I think that's an incredibly positive and strong note to end this on. So thank you so much for joining us today,
Thank
Dax.
you, Felicia.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening. Join us again next week. You can find more information about how to get in touch with Dax and Salterbaxter in the show notes. And don't forget to follow and subscribe.